So I wanted to see if AI could code a horror game from scratch. I asked ChatGPT how to make a horror game, followed each of the steps I was given to make the horror game, and got ChatGPT to code the game. I made a video about that, and overall, here's how the game turned out. As you could see, ChatGPT created a horror game. We had a dark environment, an enemy, and even a jump scare. But I wanted to try another challenge. I wanted to see if I could make the exact same horror game better than AI. The first thing I needed to do was check out the original game again and see what I could do better. Probably nothing. The original game was a 3D game. Now, here's the thing, I don't really make 3D games. I mean, I've made a 3D Minecraft horror game, and I've made a 3D Mr. Beast horror game, but I don't usually make 3D games. So I wanted to try remake this game in 2D. Since we're making a 2D game for this video, we're going to be using GameMaker to create this game, which is what I use to create most of my games and who have actually sponsored this video, but I'll talk more about that after. For now, I had to make a player sprite and a player movement system, and here's what we had. I was going to use a similar process to what AI told me to use for our original horror game, so the next thing I needed was a game environment. I found some free assets on itch.io for our forest environment, added them to our game, and things were looking not really like a horror game. So all I had to do using GameMaker's filters and effect tool was add a few effects, and we had sort of a horror game. To make our game look more like a horror game, I added a lighting effect. And this is what we had. Now we needed to add our game enemy. I programmed an enemy AI, and the way it works is that if the player is in a certain range of the enemy will follow the player. However, if the player is not in a certain range of the enemy will follow an enemy AI object that starts at a random point on the map. When the enemy reaches this enemy AI object, the enemy AI object will teleport to another random point of the map, to which the enemy will follow again. For the enemy sprite, I just took the enemy asset from the original game and made it into a 2D sprite, and it worked. Now that we had a player movement system, a forest environment, our game kinda looked like a horror game, and we had an enemy, it was time to improve on some of the horror elements of the game. But before I do that, I wanted to talk about our sponsor of this video, GameMaker. GameMaker is an all-in-one game development engine, and like I mentioned earlier in the video, it's what I'm using to make our horror game. One of my favorite things about GameMaker are all the tutorials you get to help with making games. They have a tutorial where you can make an arcade shooter in 15 minutes, so I decided to try it for this video. The tutorial was really easy to follow, and sure enough, after about 15 minutes, I ended up with this game. Now, what's cool about GameMaker is it's so easy to use that after following this tutorial and making your own version of this game, you can easily add new features. I decided to add an upgrade system to the game, which will spawn in at random intervals and allow the player to shoot rocks at the other rocks. GameMaker is free to download and use, and you can also export for free to all non-console platforms. For non-console commercial projects, GameMaker now has a one-time perpetual license, so if you've ever wanted to try making games, I'd highly recommend doing so using GameMaker, which you can download with my link in the description. Anyway, back to the video. The first horror element we needed to improve on was the lighting system. We added this style of lighting to our game, which I think was just way more effective for a horror game. The next element we needed to improve on was making the game look more like a horror game. I decided to change some of the assets I was using in the game with different free assets from itch.io, including a new forest environment and a player sprite. I think it turned out pretty good. Now, the next feature I needed to add to the game was one of the most popular horror elements in horror games, the jump scare. Here's the jump scare in our original game, and here's the jump scare in our remake. Now that we had pretty much remade the original AI horror game, it was time to actually add gameplay to the game. In the original game, the player would just have to avoid the enemy and wait for the jump scare. That was literally it. So for our new game, I decided to add some actual gameplay. In the last horror game I made, which was a Mr. Beast horror game, the player had to compete in a Mr. Beast challenge video. A challenge video in which they must survive in a forest for 10 minutes while there's a possessed Mr. Beast chasing them. And I thought this gameplay concept worked well for a horror game, so I just decided to use it in this one. And there we go. We had gameplay. All the player needs to do is try survive 10 minutes in this forest whilst avoiding the enemy. Let's test out the game. Alright guys, and here we are in our horror game. As you can see, we've got the player here, we got the lighting system, and we're in our forest environment. So pretty much all we have to do is watch out for the enemy. So one thing that I like about this game is that there's actually kind of something the player has to do, as opposed to the other game where you would just wait for the jump scare. And I really like the lighting system in this as well. Look, okay, there we go. All right, let's go this way for a little bit, and I wonder where that enemy is. Oh, there it is. Okay, so there we go. We lost, and it looks like the enemy is there again. So should we play another round maybe? Yeah, let's see if we can escape the enemy this time. No. All right, let's go again. Why not? Even though we had a remade version of our original AI horror game, I wanted to add another feature to our game. This was our arcade shooter from earlier in the video without any of our upgrades, and this was our arcade shooter from earlier in the video with our upgrades. Our horror game needed a feature like this, an upgrade system that the player can unlock that will help them against the enemy. So we added an upgrade system that will allow the player to shoot rocks at the enemy. Okay, but we actually made it so the player could unlock a gun to use against the enemy, and now our game was complete. Alright guys, and here we are with our upgraded version of our horror game. So now all we have to do is try to find the gun. Here it is, pick that up, and now we're gonna look for the enemy. And there we go, there's our remade version of the AI horror game. I'd like to once again thank GameMaker for sponsoring this video. If you want to make 2D games like this one, or like the arcade shooter from earlier in the video, you can download GameMaker for free using my link in the description. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to leave a like, feel free to leave a comment, and you can also subscribe if you're new to the channel. Peace.